The first thing Command noticed wasn't the smoke trailing from the A-10 Thunderbolt's left engine, or even the jagged holes punched through its titanium bathtub cockpit. It was the radio silence. For 47 minutes, call sign Reaper 7 had been dark, vanished somewhere over the Hindu Kush Mountains, where 3 Navy SEAL teams had gone missing 72 hours earlier. The rescue mission briefing had been brutal in its simplicity. No one survives that valley. The terrain was a death trap, the Taliban presence overwhelming, and satellite imagery showed nothing but scattered debris and burning wreckage where American forces had last been seen. But now, against every tactical probability and meteorological forecast, an A-10 Warthog was limping home through morning fog that shouldn't exist, piloted by someone who should have been dead 3 times over. Tower control watched their screens in stunned silence as the aircraft's transponder painted a ghost-like signature across their radar. The plane moved with the deliberate, measured pace of a wounded animal that knows exactly how much strength it has left. Major Catalina, Kit Voss, had never been anyone's first choice for anything. At 34, she carried the quiet competence of someone who'd spent 15 years proving herself in a world that questioned her presence at every briefing table, every deployment roster, every combat sortie. Her personnel file read like a catalog of near misses and what-ifs, passed over for squadron leadership twice, transferred between units 4 times, always competent but never quite fitting the image of what a warrior pilot should look like. She was too thoughtful for the hotshots, too aggressive for the strategists, too honest for the politicians. The morning had started with Colonel Reeves delivering the mission parameters with the enthusiasm of a man reading obituaries. Intelligence suggested the SEAL teams had been ambushed in a narrow valley system designated Objective Razorback, where Soviet-era A-10 missiles nested among ancient rock formations like metal wasps. No pilot had successfully penetrated that airspace in 3 attempts. 2 F-16s had been forced to abort after taking heavy fire. One Apache had barely made it back with its tail rotor destroyed. "This isn't a rescue mission," Reeves had said, his weathered face grim under fluorescent briefing room lights. "This is a recovery operation. We need confirmation on our people, nothing more. Get in, verify status, get out. No heroics, no extended engagement." Kit had nodded, her fingers already tracing flight patterns on the tactical map spread before her. She'd studied every satellite image, every terrain elevation, every known enemy position, until the landscape existed as clearly in her mind as her own reflection. The other pilots in the room had exchanged glances, the kind that said they were watching someone volunteer for a suicide mission with the quiet determination of someone making peace with the inevitable. The A-10's engines had turned over smooth and strong in the pre-dawn darkness, their familiar rumble a comfort against the uncertainty ahead. Kit ran through her pre-flight checklist with ritual precision, each switch and gauge verification, a small prayer to whatever gods watched over pilots stupid enough to fly alone into hell. The aircraft responded to her touch like an old friend, 30,000 pounds of titanium and determination, ready to carry her into whatever waited beyond the mountains. What she found in that valley would change everything, not just for the missing SEALs, but for every person who had ever underestimated the quiet major with the steady hands and the call sign that would soon become legend. The smoke trailing from her engines as she limped home carried more than the residue of combat. It carried proof that sometimes the most dangerous thing in the sky isn't the one making the most noise. Control Tower's radio crackled to life with a voice steady as winter steel. "Tower, this is Reaper 7 requesting immediate emergency landing. Wounded bird inbound with precious cargo." In the background, barely audible through static, came the sound that would haunt every person in that control room for the rest of their lives. The weak but unmistakable voices of American servicemen who should have been ghosts, calling out coordinates and medical status reports from the cargo bay of an aircraft that had just accomplished the impossible. The valley had been designated Objective Razorback for good reason. Satellite imagery revealed a natural amphitheater carved from granite and malice, where centuries of warfare had left the stone scarred with bullet marks and the soil dark with blood that never quite washed away. Ancient trade routes wound through the terrain like arteries, and Taliban forces had turned every cave, every boulder pile, every shepherd's hut into a potential firing position. Kit approached from the southeast, using morning thermal currents rising from the valley floor to mask her heat signature. The A-10's turbofan engines ran quieter than most fighter aircraft, but in these mountains, sound carried like a death sentence. She descended through cloud cover that shouldn't have existed according to meteorological reports, the moisture beading on her canopy glass in patterns that reminded her of tears. Her heads-up display painted threat indicators across the landscape in amber and red, each symbol representing someone with the capability and intention to kill her. Surface-to-air missile sites dotted the ridgelines like electronic tombstones, but intelligence had missed something crucial. The positions were too perfect, too evenly spaced, too visible. Kit's tactical mind, honed by years of studying enemy doctrine, recognized the pattern immediately. These weren't defensive positions, they were bait. The real ambush waited deeper in the valley, where natural rock formations provided cover and overlapping fields of fire. Kit could see it now, the way the terrain funneled aircraft into a kill zone where escape routes narrowed to nothing and altitude options disappeared. The previous pilots had flown exactly where the enemy wanted them to fly, following conventional attack patterns that any competent adversary could predict. But Kit had never been accused of being conventional. Instead of following the valley floor toward the primary target area, she rolled the A-10 inverted and dove toward what appeared to be solid rock face on the northern ridge. At the last possible second, she pulled through a knife-edge gap between stone spires that no sane pilot would attempt, emerging behind enemy lines with the kind of positioning that tactical manuals said was impossible. The Taliban fighters below looked up in confusion as 30,000 pounds of American titanium and fury appeared where physics said nothing should exist. Kit's 30mm GAU-8 cannon spoke with the voice of mechanized death, sending depleted uranium rounds downrange at 65 rounds per second. The sound was distinctive, a deep, bone-shaking buzzsaw roar that infantry called the BRRRT of salvation or judgment, depending on which end you were facing. Enemy positions evaporated under the precise application of overwhelming firepower. Kit worked systematically, each gun run calculated to maximum effect while minimizing exposure time. She used the valley's own geography against its defenders, ricocheting cannon rounds off stone walls to reach targets hiding in seemingly impregnable positions. The A-10 moved like a predator through the confined space, never presenting the same angle twice, never staying in any enemy's crosshairs long enough for a clean shot. But even the most perfectly executed attack plan survives only until enemy contact, and the Taliban had learned from previous encounters. As Kit banked for her third gun run, warning alarms screamed through her cockpit. Multiple missile launches, fired not from the positions she'd been briefing against, but from caves hidden in the valley's deepest shadows. The enemy had been waiting for someone good enough to penetrate their outer defenses. Kit's training took over as conscious thought became liability. She dispensed chaff and flares in pre-programmed sequences while pulling G-forces that would have grayed out less conditioned pilots. The A-10 twisted through three-dimensional space like a dancer, trading altitude for airspeed, using every trick of energy management to stay ahead of missiles that wanted nothing more than to reduce her aircraft to scattered debris. The first SA-18 detonated close enough to pepper her left wing with shrapnel, punching holes through control surfaces that suddenly made the aircraft feel sluggish and unpredictable. Kit compensated with stick and rudder inputs that came from muscle memory rather than conscious decision, keeping the wounded warthog in controlled flight through sheer pilot skill and mechanical sympathy. Then she saw them, three figures in desert camouflage moving between rock formations 600 meters below. Americans, based on their movement patterns and equipment silhouettes. Alive, but barely, judging by how they supported each other across the broken ground. The missing SEAL team wasn't scattered debris after all. They were evading and surviving in terrain that should have been their tomb. Kit keyed her radio with thumb pressure that felt like prayer. Any station, this is Reaper 7. I have visual on 3 personnel matching friendly profile. Grid reference 41R Mr. 23456788901. Requesting immediate backup for combat rescue operation. The response came back through static that sounded like mechanical laughter. Reaper 7, negative on backup. Weather conditions deteriorating rapidly. Estimate 0 sealing in 30 minutes. You are alone out there, pilot. Recommend immediate extraction while possible. Kit looked down at the 3 figures still moving with the desperate determination of men who refused to die quietly. She thought about her personnel file, filled with evaluations that praised her competence while questioning her judgment. She thought about mission parameters that called for verification and extraction, nothing more. She thought about the comfortable certainty of following orders that made tactical sense. Then she thought about 3 Americans who had survived 72 hours in hell because they believed someone would come for them. Kit rolled the A-10 into a diving turn toward what every regulation, every protocol, every sane voice in her head said was certain death. But sometimes the most important decisions are made not in briefing rooms or planning sessions, but in the space between heartbeats when a pilot realizes that being competent isn't enough. Sometimes you have to be something more. The landing zone Kit had chosen existed only in her imagination, and a brief section of relatively flat ground wedged between granite walls that rose like the ribs of some ancient cathedral. No pilot had ever attempted to land an A-10 in terrain like this. The aircraft manual specifically warned against operations in confined spaces due to limited maneuverability and restricted escape options. But the manual had been written by people who had never seen 3 Americans fighting for their lives, while their country's resources remained safely beyond the horizon. Kit brought the Warthog down through turbulence that felt like flying through a washing machine filled with rocks. Mountain winds caught the aircraft's battle damage and tried to flip it inverted, but she compensated with control inputs that came from 15 years of flying aircraft that other people had given up on. The A-10 touched down on ground that was more concept than runway, bouncing twice before settling into a landing roll that used every inch of available space. The 3 SEAL team members appeared from concealment with the cautious efficiency of men who had survived by trusting nothing and verifying everything. Their leader, a master chief whose nameplate read MORRSON, approached with the careful gait of someone operating on determination and medical supplies that had run out 2 days ago. His left arm hung useless, secured against his body with improvised strapping made from torn uniform fabric. "Ma'am," Morrison said, his voice carrying the hoarse rasp of someone who had been whispering orders for 3 days straight. "I don't know who sent you, but we've got wounded that need immediate medical attention and intelligence that can't wait for regular extraction." Kit popped her canopy and began emergency shutdown procedures while keeping one eye on the ridgelines above. Every second on the ground increased their vulnerability exponentially. But these men needed more than just a ride home. They needed someone willing to believe their mission had been worth the impossible risk she was taking. The second SEAL, Petty Officer First Class Rodriguez, carried data storage devices secured in waterproof cases despite wounds that had soaked his uniform with blood from at least 3 different locations. His eyes held the peculiar intensity of someone who had seen intelligence worth dying for, information that could change the tactical situation across the entire theater of operations. The third man, Hospital Corpsman Second Class Williams, moved with the measured pace of someone rationing his strength across an unknown distance. He had kept his teammates alive through medical skills learned in textbooks and refined in environments where mistakes meant death rather than poor grades. His aid bag was nearly empty, but his hands remained steady and his voice calm as he provided medical status updates with clinical precision. Chief Morrison has compound fracture, left radius and ulna, onset infection probable, Williams reported while helping secure his patients in the A-10's cargo area. Rodriguez has multiple shrapnel wounds, none immediately life-threatening but requiring surgical intervention within 12 hours. I've got 3 cracked ribs and possible concussion, but I'm mobile and functional. Kit listened while running her own calculations about weight distribution, fuel consumption, and the physics of getting an overloaded aircraft out of a space that had barely been adequate for landing. The math was unforgiving, but she had learned long ago that pilots who waited for perfect conditions never flew anywhere important. Morrison pulled himself into the cargo area with the grimace of someone whose pain medication had been rationed to nothing but willpower and duty. "Ma'am, before we lift off, you need to understand what we found up here. This wasn't a random ambush. This was a test. Someone wanted to see how we'd respond to losing a SEAL team in this specific location." The intelligence picture Morrison painted changed everything about their current tactical situation. The Taliban forces in this valley weren't just defending territory. They were proving concept for a new kind of warfare that could spread across the entire region. They had been studying American rescue protocols, learning response times, identifying vulnerabilities in procedures that had been developed for conventional conflicts. "They knew we'd send aircraft," Rodriguez added, his voice tight with pain but clear with professional focus. "They knew we'd follow standard search and rescue patterns. They've been mapping our responses, building countermeasures, preparing for something bigger than just this valley." Kit felt the weight of information that transformed a simple rescue mission into something that could affect strategic decisions at levels far above her pay grade. But right now, strategic implications mattered less than the immediate tactical problem of getting 4 Americans out of a location where the enemy was undoubtedly converging on their position with overwhelming force and intimate knowledge of local terrain. She completed her restart checklist with the methodical precision of someone who understood that small mistakes in critical moments tended to have permanent consequences. The A-10's engines spun up with their characteristic whine, 3,900 pounds of thrust preparing to lift 40,000 pounds of aircraft, personnel, and intelligence that couldn't be allowed to fall into enemy hands. The takeoff run would require everything the aircraft had to give, and more than the landing zone was designed to handle. Kit advanced the throttles to full military power while standing on the brakes, building up energy for a performance that would either launch them towards safety or turn them into a crater with international implications. The takeoff that followed defied several laws of physics and at least one regulation about maximum gross weight limitations. Kit held the A-10 on the ground until the very last possible moment, building airspeed that might mean the difference between flight and catastrophic ground impact. When she finally pulled back on the stick, the aircraft left the ground with the reluctant authority of something that understood the mathematics but disagreed with the conclusions. They cleared the granite walls by margins that could be measured in inches rather than feet, the warthog clawing for altitude through air that seemed too thin to support anything heavier than hope. Kit coaxed performance from the aircraft through pilot techniques that combined technical knowledge with something that felt very much like prayer, trading every advantage for the altitude and airspeed that might keep them alive long enough to reach friendly airspace. The enemy response came immediately and overwhelmingly. Surface-to-air missiles launched from positions that had been invisible during her initial attack, creating a complex 3-dimensional threat environment that required constant maneuvering to avoid. Kit flew the A-10 through evasive patterns that pushed both aircraft and pilot to their absolute limits, dispensing countermeasures while maintaining enough control authority to keep them airborne. The first hit came from a missile that detonated just after the left engine nacelle, sending shrapnel through control surfaces and hydraulic lines with the precision of a surgeon and the subtlety of a sledgehammer. Warning lights illuminated across Kit's instrument panel like a constellation of mechanical distress. each amber and red indicator representing some system that had just transitioned from operational to questionable. But the A-10 had been designed by people who understood that combat aircraft needed to absorb punishment and continue fighting, and the Thunderbolt lived up to its reputation as the most survivable close air support platform ever built. Redundant systems automatically compensated for damaged components, backup hydraulics maintained control authority, and the titanium bathtub that surrounded the cockpit deflected fragments that would have been lethal in less robust aircraft. Kit felt the aircraft's handling characteristics change, as damaged systems altered the relationship between pilot input and aircraft response. But her hands and feet, automatically compensated through muscle memory, developed across thousands of hours in similar aircraft facing similar challenges. The Warthog continued flying not because the damage was insignificant, but because both pilot and aircraft had been designed to function effectively when everything went wrong simultaneously. Morrison's voice came through the intercom with the steady professionalism of someone who had experienced combat from both ends of the rescue equation. "Ma'am, we're taking ground fire from multiple positions, but your flying is keeping us ahead of their targeting solutions. Whatever they're paying you, it's not enough." Kit would have smiled under different circumstances, but right now her attention was focused on the delicate balance between airspeed and altitude that kept them in the narrow envelope between falling out of the sky and flying into something solid. The valley walls blurred past in a gray-brown smear of granite and shadow, and each second brought them closer to either safety or the kind of impact that would make identification difficult. The weather that command had warned about began to manifest as ceiling and visibility that dropped with the sudden authority of mountain conditions that followed no meteorological schedule. Kit found herself flying through cloud formations that reduced her visual references to nothing while simultaneously dealing with battle damage that made instrument flying more art than science. Rodriguez's voice joined the intercom conversation with the clinical tone of someone providing intelligence updates while bleeding from multiple wounds. "Ma'am, based on missile launch patterns and response times, I'm estimating enemy strength at significantly higher levels than briefed. This was a prepared defensive position, not an opportunistic ambush." The implications of that assessment changed Kit's tactical calculations about their route home. If the enemy had been prepared for exactly this kind of rescue attempt, then conventional extraction routes would likely be covered by additional defensive positions designed to catch aircraft fleeing the valley. Kit made a decision that violated every standard procedure for egress from hostile territory. Instead of taking the most direct route to friendly lines, she turned deeper into the mountain range, toward terrain so hostile that no rational enemy would expect aircraft to survive. Williams provided medical updates with the calm professionalism of someone who had learned to function effectively, while everything around him exploded. "All patients stable for transport, but Chief Morrison needs surgical intervention within the next 6 hours. Rodriguez is losing blood faster than I'd prefer, but he's maintaining consciousness and vital signs are within acceptable parameters." Kit acknowledged the medical sitrep while navigating through terrain that seemed designed by committee to kill aircraft. The peaks around them rose to altitudes that left little margin for error, and the valleys between them created wind patterns that could flip an aircraft inverted without warning. But this same hostile terrain provided concealment from enemy radar systems and missile sites that had been positioned to cover more conventional flight paths. The A-10's damaged left engine began producing vibrations that Kit could feel through the airframe, mechanical symptoms that suggested internal damage progressing toward complete failure. She adjusted power settings to compensate while calculating fuel consumption rates that would determine whether they reached friendly territory with engines running, or as a glider with very poor aerodynamic characteristics. Morrison noticed the change in engine note and keyed the intercom with the kind of question that experienced combat veterans learn to ask. "Ma'am, are we still flying on both engines, or are we down to one and optimism?" Kit's response carried the matter-of-fact tone of someone discussing mechanical problems that were significant but not yet catastrophic. Left engine is producing power but developing vibrations that suggest bearing failure or foreign object damage. Right engine is operating normally. We're still in controlled flight with adequate power margin, but our options are becoming more limited with each minute. The weather continued to deteriorate as they climbed toward the mountain passes that represented their best route back to friendly airspace. Visibility dropped to near zero, and ice began forming on the aircraft's leading edges despite anti-icing systems that were functioning at the edge of their design parameters. Kit flew through conditions that would have grounded commercial aviation, while dealing with battle damage that made every control input an exercise in mechanical sympathy. Rodriguez continued his intelligence briefing with the determined focus of someone who understood that the information he carried might be more valuable than the lives of everyone aboard. "Ma'am, the enemy positions we encountered were equipped with communications gear and coordination capabilities that suggest external support from professional military advisors. This wasn't local Taliban. This was a test bed for tactics that could be exported to other theaters." The strategic implications of that intelligence made their survival even more critical, but Kit remained focused on the immediate tactical problem of keeping an overloaded, battle-damaged aircraft flying through weather conditions that challenged even fully operational machines. The A-10 responded to her inputs with the reluctant cooperation of something that understood its situation, but disagreed with the physics involved. As they approached the high passes that would take them back toward friendly territory, Kit realized that their ordeal was far from over. The weather ahead looked worse than what they were flying through. The aircraft's mechanical condition was deteriorating with each minute, and their fuel state was approaching the point where decisions would be made by mathematics rather than tactics. But they were still flying, still fighting, still carrying intelligence that could save lives, and 3 Americans who had refused to die quietly in a valley designed to be their tomb. The mountain pass ahead appeared through cloud cover like a gap in the world itself, carved from granite and ice into a passage barely wide enough for aircraft wings. Kit approached the narrow corridor with the kind of precision that came from understanding that small errors in confined spaces tended to have large consequences. The A-10's wingspan measured 57 feet, and the gap between rock walls appeared to offer maybe 70 feet of clearance in conditions where depth perception was compromised by weather and battle damage to her canopy glass. Crosswinds through the pass created turbulence that tried to slam the aircraft into stone walls with the persistence of something that took mechanical destruction personally. Kit compensated with control inputs that came from muscle memory developed across years of flying in conditions that other people avoided, keeping the Warthog centered in the narrow passage through pilot skill and what felt increasingly like divine intervention. The left engine's vibrations intensified as they climbed toward the pass's highest point. Mechanical symptoms that suggested catastrophic failure was more a question of when rather than if. Kit monitored engine parameters while calculating single-engine performance capabilities in thin mountain air, with an aircraft loaded beyond normal specifications. The mathematics were unforgiving, but she had learned long ago that pilots who let numbers determine their actions never flew anywhere that mattered. Morrison's voice came through the intercom with the kind of professional calm that experienced combat veterans used when discussing situations that were objectively terrible. "Ma'am, I can see daylight ahead through the pass. Whatever happens with that engine, you've already done more than anyone had a right to ask." Kit acknowledged the comment while focusing on the delicate balance between power settings and altitude that kept them in the narrow envelope of controlled flight. The A-10 was designed to absorb punishment and continue fighting, but even the most robust aircraft had limits that could be exceeded through sufficient application of enemy fire and adverse weather conditions. Williams provided medical updates with clinical precision that masked his own pain from injuries that he continued to treat as secondary to his patient's needs. Chief Morrison's condition is stable, but requires surgical intervention within the next 4 hours. Rodriguez is maintaining consciousness, but showing signs of progressive blood loss that I can't effectively control in flight. My assessment is that all personnel require immediate medical attention upon landing. The weather on the far side of the mountain pass revealed itself as marginally better than the conditions they had been flying through. But marginally better still meant ceiling and visibility that challenged instrument flying capabilities in a battle-damaged aircraft with questionable engine reliability. Kit began a careful descent toward terrain that offered more options for emergency landing, while maintaining enough altitude to reach friendly airspace if the left engine finally decided to quit. Rodriguez continued his intelligence briefing with the determined focus of someone who understood that information was worthless if it never reached the people who needed it. "Ma'am, the coordination we observed suggests enemy capabilities that exceed current intelligence assessments. They've been studying our procedures, learning our response patterns, building countermeasures specifically designed to defeat American search and rescue operations." That intelligence painted a picture of threats that extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. But Kit remained focused on the physics of keeping 40,000 pounds of damaged aircraft airborne through weather conditions that would have challenged even fully operational machines. The A-10 responded to her inputs with the mechanical cooperation of something that understood its limitations, but trusted its pilot's judgment about what was possible. As they descended toward lower altitudes where the air was thicker and the weather less hostile, Kit began to believe that they might actually survive an operation that had violated every regulation about risk management and tactical common sense. The aircraft was still flying, the engines were still producing power, and they were carrying intelligence that could change strategic calculations across the entire theater of operations. But survival required more than just reaching friendly airspace. It required landing an aircraft that had been damaged in ways that wouldn't become apparent until she tried to perform the precise control inputs necessary for approach and touchdown. Battle damage had a way of revealing itself at the worst possible moments, and Kit knew that their ordeal wouldn't be over until they were on the ground with engines shut down and wounded personnel in the hands of medical professionals. The left engine failure, when it finally came, arrived with the sudden finality of something that had been threatening disaster for the past hour, but had waited until the worst possible moment to actually quit. Warning lights illuminated across Kit's instrument panel as the engine seized with a mechanical scream that could be heard through the cockpit despite sound insulation, designed to protect pilots from the noise of their own weapon systems. Kit immediately initiated single-engine emergency procedures, while maintaining aircraft control through the asymmetric thrust condition that tried to roll them inverted and send them into an unrecoverable spiral toward terrain that offered no forgiveness for mechanical failures. She adjusted power settings and control inputs to compensate for the loss of half her available thrust, while calculating glide ratios and emergency landing options, with the part of her mind that remained calm during situations when everything went wrong simultaneously. Morrison keyed the intercom with the kind of professional concern that experienced military personnel used when they realized their transportation had just become significantly less reliable. "Ma'am, I'm not an aviator, but that didn't sound like normal engine operation." Kit's response carried the matter-of-fact tone of someone discussing mechanical problems that were serious but not yet hopeless. "Left engine failure, but we're still flying on the right engine with adequate power for controlled flight. We're going to need to expedite our approach to the nearest suitable airfield, but we're not in immediate danger of falling out of the sky." The nearest suitable airfield turned out to be Bagram Air Base, still 37 minutes away at their current airspeed and fuel consumption rate. Kit began a careful descent that balanced the need to conserve fuel against the requirement to maintain enough altitude for emergency landing options if the remaining engine decided to quit. Single-engine flying in a combat-loaded required pilot techniques that combined technical knowledge with mechanical sympathy, and what felt very much like negotiation with aerodynamic forces that preferred aircraft to have two working engines. Williams continued monitoring his patients while providing updates that reflected his professional assessment of their medical status. Chief Morrison is showing signs of infection progression that requires immediate antibiotic intervention. Rodriguez's blood pressure is dropping despite fluid replacement efforts. My recommendation is immediate medical attention upon landing. The approach to Bagram required Kit to fly a single-engine approach in an aircraft that had been damaged by enemy fire while carrying wounded personnel who needed immediate medical attention. She configured the A-10 for landing while managing power settings on the remaining engine, with the kind of precision that came from understanding that small mistakes in critical moments tended to have permanent consequences. Rodriguez maintained his intelligence briefing despite blood loss and pain that would have incapacitated less determined personnel. "Ma'am, the tactical intelligence we're carrying includes enemy communications intercepts that reveal coordination with external advisors and planning for expanded operations across multiple provinces. This information needs to reach theater intelligence within hours, not days." Kit acknowledged the intelligence priorities while focusing on the approach that would determine whether their survival story ended with successful recovery or became a cautionary tale about the dangers of attempting impossible missions. The A-10 descended through approach parameters that challenged both aircraft and pilot capabilities, but they were still flying under control toward an airfield equipped with medical facilities and personnel who could provide the care her passengers desperately needed. The landing, when it finally came, was less a controlled arrival than a barely managed impact with runway pavement that had never looked so welcoming. Kit brought the battle-damaged A-10 down with the kind of precision that came from 15 years of flying aircraft that other people had written off as unflyable, touching down on centerline with enough control authority remaining to taxi clear of the active runway. Emergency vehicles were already moving toward their position as Kit completed shutdown procedures for an aircraft that had just proven that determination and skill could overcome mathematical probability when the stakes were high enough. The left engine showed obvious signs of catastrophic internal failure, and the airframe displayed battle damage that would require weeks of repair work. But they had accomplished something that intelligence briefings had declared impossible. Morrison was first out of the aircraft, moving with the careful efficiency of someone whose injuries were significant but not immediately life-threatening. Medical personnel immediately began assessment and treatment procedures, while intelligence officers waited with the patience of people who understood that wounded personnel took priority over classified information, regardless of strategic importance. Rodriguez transferred his intelligence materials to waiting analysts with the precise handoff procedures of someone who had carried classified information through hostile territory and understood its value in terms of lives that might be saved through tactical advantages. His wounds required immediate surgical intervention, but he remained conscious and professionally focused until medical personnel took over his care. Williams supervised the medical evacuation of his teammates with the clinical attention to detail that had kept them alive through 72 hours in terrain designed to kill Americans. His own injuries required treatment, but he remained functional until other medical professionals could assume responsibility for patient care that had become his personal mission. Kit completed post-flight inspection of an aircraft that had just performed far beyond its design specifications, while being shot at by people who took mechanical destruction very personally. The A-10 would fly again after extensive repair work, but right now it resembled something that had been through a mechanical war and emerged victorious through superior engineering and pilot skill that had pushed both machine and operator beyond their supposed limitations. The intelligence debriefing that followed revealed the full scope of what the SEAL team had discovered in that valley, information that would change tactical approaches across multiple theaters of operation and save lives through better understanding of enemy capabilities and intentions. Their rescue had accomplished far more than just bringing home 3 Americans. It had provided strategic intelligence that could prevent future ambushes and improve survival rates for personnel operating in hostile territory. Colonel Reeves arrived at the medical facility with the kind of expression that suggested he was still processing the fact that a mission he had expected to fail had instead succeeded beyond any reasonable expectation. He found Kit in the crew rest area, completing after-action reports with the methodical attention to detail that would help other pilots learn from her experience. "Major Voss," Reeves said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who was still adjusting his assessment of personnel he thought he understood. "I need to understand how you accomplished something that intelligence assessments declared impossible." Kit looked up from paperwork that documented mechanical performance and tactical decisions, with the precision required for lessons learned that might save other lives. "Sir, sometimes impossible just means no one has figured out how to do it yet. The aircraft performed as designed, the enemy made tactical errors, and we got lucky with weather conditions that provided concealment when we needed it most." Reeves studied the pilot who had just redefined what was possible in his theater of operations, recognizing that her personnel file had somehow failed to capture the kind of operational capability that could turn strategic defeat into tactical victory through superior execution under impossible conditions. "Major, I'm recommending you for immediate promotion and transfer to a position where your capabilities can be better utilized." Kit continued completing her paperwork with the same methodical precision she brought to everything else, understanding that recognition was less important than ensuring other pilots could learn from experience that had been purchased with risk that should have been fatal. "Sir, I appreciate the recognition, but right now I'm more interested in making sure the intelligence those SEALs died to collect gets to the people who can use it effectively." The conversation that followed covered tactical lessons, strategic implications, and personnel decisions that would affect combat operations across the region. But the real story was simpler. Sometimes the most dangerous thing in the sky isn't the one making the most noise, and sometimes the people others underestimate are exactly the ones who accomplish the impossible when everything depends on someone refusing to accept that failure is inevitable. 3 months later, Major Catalina Kit Voss was promoted to lieutenant colonel and transferred to a planning position where her operational experience would influence strategic decisions affecting thousands of personnel. The A-10 she had flown through impossible conditions was repaired and returned to service, carrying nose art that depicted a smoking aircraft emerging from mountain peaks with the inscription, Reaper 7. Impossible is just another mission parameter. The SEAL team recovered fully from their injuries and returned to operational status with intelligence training that incorporated lessons learned from their experience in Objective Razorback. Their debriefing materials became required reading for personnel operating in similar environments, and their survival techniques were integrated into advanced training programs that prepared other Americans for operations in hostile territory. The intelligence they had collected led to tactical changes that prevented similar ambushes and saved lives through better understanding of enemy capabilities and operational patterns. Rodriguez received the Silver Star for his role in gathering and protecting classified information under combat conditions, while Morrison and Williams were recognized for leadership and medical care that had kept their team alive through impossible circumstances. But perhaps the most important change was harder to quantify. Across multiple air bases and training facilities, pilots began to understand that competence and determination could overcome mathematical probability when the stakes were high enough, and someone was willing to refuse to accept that failure was inevitable. The story of Reaper 7 became legend not because it was impossible, but because it proved that sometimes impossible just meant no one had figured out how to do it yet. Kit's call sign evolved from simple radio identification to something that carried weight in briefing rooms and ready areas, where pilots discussed missions that pushed the boundaries of what aircraft and personnel could accomplish. Reaper had originally been assigned because of her methodical approach to target engagement, but it had become something more: recognition that some pilots could bring Americans home from places where mathematics said no one should survive. The morning briefings at forward operating bases began to include tactical scenarios based on her experience, teaching other pilots how to use terrain and weather conditions as weapons when conventional approaches failed. Her techniques for single-engine flying in combat-loaded aircraft became standard curriculum at weapons schools, and her approach to risk assessment influenced tactical doctrine across multiple aircraft types. Years later, when young pilots asked about the smoking A-10 that had returned from Objective Razorback carrying 3 Americans who should have been ghosts, the answer always included the same fundamental lesson: the most dangerous enemies are often the ones who refuse to accept limitations that other people consider absolute. And sometimes the person everyone underestimates is exactly the one who accomplishes what everyone else considers impossible. The sky remembers everything, from the first powered flight to every aircraft that has pushed the boundaries of what's possible when human determination meets mechanical capability. In that vast archive of aviation history, the story of Reaper 7 occupies a special place. Proof that competence, courage, and refusal to accept defeat can overcome tactical situations that appear hopeless to